right, good morning. Well, today we will be talking about everybody's favorite subject, which is macroevolution. Sure you were looking forward to this morning, sense the sarcasm there. But that's what we'll be diving into today. We're pretty much picking up from where we left off from 2 Sundays ago, where we talked about naturalism, which is the belief that there are no divine forces or divine creator involved in the world. And macroevolution is really the mechanism of naturalism. It is really the kind of the foundational belief with it. So today we'll be talking about macroevolution. We'll define what it is, and then we're going to talk about its history and explain its foundational components. So mainly talking about how macroevolution developed into what it is today. And we'll do that by discussing two of its early proponents and probably most influential proponents, who are going to be Lamarck and Darwin. But I of course want to preface this by saying we are going to talk about a lot of items that we will disagree with. And my approach is not to advocate for any of these beliefs or even to develop coherent arguments against them this morning, but rather to just explain them so that we're aware of what has contributed to the culture and in which we live. And however, I'd like to begin by reading Psalm 104 to keep us grounded, and then to remind us once again what the scriptures teach us on creation. So if you will turn there, and we'll use this to start us this morning. Psalm 104, verse 1. Verse 1, and we'll read through verse 15, though I'd want to keep going. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord my God, you are very great. You are clothed with splendor and majesty, covering yourself with light as with a garment, stretching out the heavens like a tent. He lays the beams of his chamber on the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He rides on the wings of the wind. He makes his messengers winds, his ministers a flaming fire. He set the earth on its foundations so that it should never be moved. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. You make springs gush forth in the valleys, they flow between the hills. They give drink to every beast of the field, the wild donkeys quench their thirst. Beside them the birds of the heavens dwell, they sing among the branches. From your lofty abode you water the mountains, the earth is satisfied with the fruit of your work. You cause the grass to grow for the livestock and plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth and wine to gladden the heart of man, oil to make his face shine, and bread to strengthen man's heart. And we'll end that there. But what an incredible passage that details God's involvement, and not just that, but the imagery that's present here that displays the sovereignty and dominion that he has over creation. This is really one of those mountaintop passages when it comes to the creation account. And so may this uplift us and remind us at the outset that the Bible makes no allowances for the universe coming into existence of its own accord, or for the universe sustaining its own existence of its own accord. So the universe was created by God, and this psalm is very clear that not only was it created by him, but it is also held together by him. And unfortunately, as we learned last time, naturalism is the view that at its core, and to the majority of its proponents, contradicts what we have just read. And macroevolution is the most dominant theory within naturalism, and so let's discuss that for this morning. So for a definition, put simply, macroevolution refers to the idea that all organisms or animals descend from one single ancestor, which means that over sufficient amounts of time, key word there, sufficient, over sufficient amounts of time, types of organisms can change into new types of organisms. And so, for example, given enough environmental stimuli, one animal can evolve into a new type of animal. And this is a rather simplistic way of putting it, but and of course there is debate at this point as well, even in terms of definitions, such as what is an organism, what is a species, what do we mean by types, what do we mean by kinds, and etc. And I don't want to get lost in all of that or get too granular, mainly because there are far more helpful resources at your disposal than myself on the issue, so I would waste your time if I tried to go deeper than I am now. But suffice it to say that macroevolution refers to the addition of new genes into the gene pool, the addition of new knowledge into the genetic system. It is not intra-species change, but rather interspecies change. And it might help if we contrast that with microevolution. So macroevolution versus micro. So microevolution refers to interspecies change, and that's really probably what we're more familiar with. That's how we get Dobermans and pugs, right? Different breeds of dogs. Having 20 different breeds of cat would be microevolution. So there are changes made in the gene pool, but there's not the introduction of brand new genetic material. So if you get a white cat and a black cat, that usually makes a tuxedo cat maybe, for example. But there's not an introduction of new genes. The cat doesn't turn into a smaller form of lynx or a tiger or into a new uncategorized type of animal. I actually learned this the other day, which I thought was hilarious, so I want to share it with you. There is a breed of dog called a Chiweenie. You can probably figure out what that is just by the name. It is the result of a dachshund and a chihuahua. So a Chiweenie. I would say a Chiweenie is an unfortunate example of microevolution.
Can I just stop right there and say one thing? We hear all around us that people say the science is settled when they look at evolution. It is not. It changes every year. There's always new stuff. But what is settled and unchanging? That's all you just read?
Yep.
It hasn't changed at all.
No, it's, and we'll get into that, but that's kind of the thing, that there is as much debate within science as there is in religion, if not more so. And so that's kind of to your point, it's like you have a lot of, religions will get, they'll get criticized for that all the time. Debate, nobody agrees. But whenever you have these dialogues and conversations within the scientific community, you'll very quickly realize that it's the same there as well, that things change all the time. But for macroevolution, however, it's not talking about this kind of interspecies change. It's the idea that given enough time, a dog can turn into a whole other type of animal. And then taking that on a broader scale, it says that given enough time, an amoeba, or a single-celled organism, can at one point turn into a wolf, or an ape can turn into a human, and so on. And all living things allegedly trace themselves back to one single-celled organism. And that organism evolved and reproduced to such an extent that now we have all of the insects and plants and animals and species and so on that we have today. And as you can imagine, the other side to this is that this kind of process surely must take an inordinate amount of time. And so for macroevolution to work, hundreds of millions, if not billions, of years are required. And so in the macroevolutionary framework, the universe must be billions of years old. And the theory, while we disagree with it, it's a great theory in the sense that it is nuanced, comprehensive, and systematic. It attempts to explain thousands of things about the creation and existence of the world, and it does this without referencing a divine creator. Thus, macroevolution is the mechanism, if you like, of atheism or naturalism. And it's really why atheism or naturalism is feasible to the unregenerate man, and that's why many people tend to gravitate towards it, because apparently everything is possible if given enough time. It's it's complex enough that it makes man feel justified for being foolish in rejecting the notion of God. It's complex enough that it gives man the illusion of intelligence or being smart for turning away from a divine creator. But now let's talk a bit about its development, kind of where it came from, how we got here today, and how we got to where it is and its impacts. So historically, the seed of macroevolution was planted in the belief in a process called spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation. And it's exactly how it sounds. It's this idea that creatures, organisms, material, living material, non-living material can generate spontaneously. It is a view that many naturalists in antiquity held to, that life can come from non-life, or that something can come from nothing. And of course today we scoff at this, but we can understand why people used to think this. Probably the most classic example of this is that if you have rotten meat or vegetables, then pretty soon flies or larvae will appear on its own or from within it. And when earlier civilization observed this event or events like it, the assumption was not that there were eggs laid by other organisms or that there were microorganisms, etc., but rather that organisms were spontaneously generated from the non-living meat or the non-living food. So the organisms were just too small for people to see, and so they assumed that the non-living meat was given life to other creatures. The same thing could be observed if you go into the woods and you look at rotten pieces of leaves and fallen trees and all the insects that come out of them, or even if you look at flowers or mushrooms that sprout out of the ground. So people would see these events all the time, and to those without current-day scientific knowledge or the tools, it appeared as if life were just coming from non-life. So spontaneous generation, that these things, that these creations, or what have you, that it would just spontaneously generate. They didn't know why, they didn't know how, they just know that it did. And so therefore, spontaneous generation. And this principle was taken and applied on a much larger scale as well, and it was applied to the creation of the world. And so spontaneous generation was significant because if it were true, then it meant that essentially something could come from nothing. Or at the very least, what is living can be produced from what is not living. And this belief in spontaneous generation, it was a dominant theory and a widely held belief up until the mid-1800s. So this thing lasted a good while. This was a pretty long-lived belief. And as you can imagine, and remember, mid-1800s, early 1800s, that's when we're really getting into the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. And so as you can imagine, this concept of spontaneous generation, when it was placed within the environment of the scientific revolution and Enlightenment, it was a philosopher or scientist playground. And so what ends up happening is as you took all these multiple wild theories about the world's creation and animals and humanity's origins, and multiple different things and ideas were propagated, even by those people who believed in God. And a good example of someone who believed in God and yet strongly argued for and put forth the idea of macroevolution is a man named Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck, Lamarck, a French zoologist. So Lamarck came on the scene at the start of the 19th century, so beginning of the 1800s, and while he believed in God, he believed that God had nothing to do with this world and was not involved in the creation of it. Nor did he believe that God intervenes in the world. So really, in theory, I guess, Lamarck was a theist, but in practice, he was an atheist. Hence why he argued so strongly for evolution. And this was not uncommon in this time period. This, as we talked about last time, deism and this kind of overall mindset that, yeah, there's a God, but he doesn't really do anything, that mindset was pretty common, especially during the Enlightenment. And so he's not out of character here. This is pretty typical. But Before we talk about what he actually believed, I do want to point out, though, that evolutionary theories had already existed prior to the 1800s. I think usually people tend to trace this specifically to Charles Darwin, and that he's extremely unique and was the creator of the concept of evolution, which he was not. So Charles Darwin most certainly did not invent the idea of evolution. The main thing that Darwin did was propose a mechanism for evolution, which is natural selection. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But in terms of evolutionary ideas, there are evolutionary ideas even in early Greece, even in early Greek philosophers, with a fellow named Anaximander, who proposed that organisms all descended from a single organism. And you see evolutionary theories in the Middle Ages, you see it in the 1500s and 1600s and so on. And so it's around. It just doesn't have this extreme momentum that we see until about the 1800s. And so then by the time you do get to the 1800s, the idea of evolution rapidly becomes popular with the sparks of the Enlightenment lighting up its coals. And so Jean-Baptiste Lamarck helped fan those flames of evolution at the outset of the 1800s, which through his book, Philosophie zoologique, written in 1809. And so now we'll talk a little bit about him and why he's significant, and then from there we'll talk a little bit more about Darwin and flesh this out. But like many before him, Lamarck argued for evolution. But what made him unique was that he proposed that all living things could trace their origins to a piece of non-living matter. So when it came to Lamarck, his theory on how life originated, or from where it originated, he based this on spontaneous generation. So he said, basically, and this is, again, a very simplistic way to put it, but basically to Lamarck, it's like at one point, there was nothing. At another point, there was something. I don't know why. But it was there and it happened, so spontaneous generation. And then from there, evolution. And that was basically his theory. And then another area in which he was unique is that he actually developed a full-fledged theory of evolution. So he'd worked out a complete system of biological evolution, whereas others merely provided speculation or conceptual framework. So while scientists before him had proposed the idea that all living things trace themselves to a single living or non-living organism or piece of matter, what have you, in his view, he was able to trace and develop an actual comprehensive system for how this occurred. And he didn't just use spontaneous generation in the theory of the world's origins, but he also believed that spontaneous generation was at work in the evolutionary process because various new components or organisms or genes appeared due to environmental stimuli through the use or disuse of specific body parts or organs. So it's like, well, how do we get new animals today? Well, you get new animals today by the existence of new organs, new body parts, so on and so forth. Well, how did those come about? How did you get new organs? How did you get new body parts? And he's like, spontaneous generation. It's like it happened. It spontaneously generated. And so that's kind of how he approaches this here. He's not able to get into extraordinary specifics, but it's this idea, you have this working theory already in existence of spontaneous generation, so now he's applying this to the evolutionary process. And given enough time, of course, this can result in entirely new types of species. And so, in his view, the environment also was a deciding factor in the development and changes of species, and spontaneous generation, that living material could come from non-living material, such as bodily fluids and organs developing, or the first organisms coming from non-living material. That was a foundational part of his evolutionary theory. And so, as we can see, spontaneous generation, even up until the early 1800s, was a foundational driving force of the philosophy of biology. However, with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, this did begin to fizzle out after experiments were able to be conducted within more controlled environments. And the classic experiment that's probably in every high school science textbook, the classic experiment that is thought to have completely disproved spontaneous generation is an experiment conducted by Louis Pasteur, the milkman, the man after whom pasteurization was named. So what Pasteur did he was kind of concerned about this whole theory, and he was going to try to put it to the test. And so what he did is he took some meat broth, so boiled some meat, took the broth, and he placed it in a neck flask, which is a very specific type of flask which isolated the broth from the external solids or particles in the air. So essentially what he was doing is he was placing it in a controlled environment and seeing if, without any kind of environmental help, if this could just cause some kind of spontaneous generation. And numerous days passed, and it was noticed that there were no bugs that had spontaneously generated from it. So this non-living broth did not give birth to life. And this was thought to disprove the theory of spontaneous generation. And then, of course, other scientists got on board and they agreed with it. And so then spontaneous generation was no longer a thing. And yet, even though it was thought to be disproven, that conceptual framework that it laid, which that something can give rise to something else, it still remained. And as a matter of fact, it was actually Pasteur who was still adamant on this piece. So another name, and this is generally what it was called, but another name for spontaneous generation was abiogenesis, so spelled like abiogenesis. Ab means not, and bio means living. Genesis means birth, so abiogenesis is basically not living birth or not living creation, so this idea of life coming from non-life. And so that was spontaneous generation, abiogenesis. However, after Pasteur's experiment, he argued that since life cannot come from non-life, the only option that remains is life coming from life, or that what is living can only be born from something else that is living, a process that he called biogenesis. So, and at this point in the scientific community, abiogenesis was out and biogenesis was in. So spontaneous generation was now effectively disproven. And the reason that's important is because most evolutionary theories at this time relied on abiogenesis, which is spontaneous generation. You could argue that it still relies on spontaneous generation today. But since spontaneous generation was now disproven, this required that all the prior evolutionary models be either discarded or severely adjusted. And so this is where Charles Darwin comes in on the scene. And just a backstory to kind of get where he's coming from. Charles Darwin was born in England, so he was an Englishman, in 1809, which is actually the exact year that Lamarck's pivotal work on evolution was also published. Darwin was born, I thought this was interesting, but he was born into a family of Unitarians, meaning that they believed in God but denied the Trinity, specifically denying the divinity of Jesus Christ. So already off to a bad start. His father was a medical doctor, and it was his dad's wish that Charles would follow in his footsteps and go into human medicine. So Charles apprenticed in medicine for some time in his adolescent years, but his true love was for the natural sciences, studying plants and animals, and his affinity and skills in those subjects actually earned him quite a bit of praise from his professors. But his father disapproved of these studies since they were not consistent with his hopes of being a medical doctor. And so, because of that, his father sent him to Christ College, which is a college in Cambridge, because he now wanted his son to be an Anglican priest. So, you know how that worked out. But this actually backfired quite a bit, because Charles's cousin was studying at Christ College as well, and it was his cousin who actually introduced him more into natural sciences and into a branch called natural theology, which is the study of the relationship between nature and theology pretty much, and how the use of science proves the existence of God. Darwin became obsessed with these kinds of topics. He had multiple conversations with his professors on these kinds of subjects, and he ended up becoming a voracious reader of books on natural theology and exploration. And then after he graduated Christ College, he did pass the exams, actually, to become a priest. But actually, after he graduated college, he decided instead to go on a voyage with some colleagues to Wales in order to observe some geological phenomena. And then from there, the rest is history. So he goes on numerous voyages to the tropics and around Europe. He tries to observe and document and collect and classify animals and insects and other things. And then it's from here that his observations of nature begin to develop. And like I said earlier, probably his primary or most innovative contribution to the dialogue on evolution was the concept of natural selection, which did truly originate with him and why he was unique among his colleagues and predecessors. So Darwin agreed with the concept of evolution, that all creatures descend from common ancestors. But he introduced the mechanism for that descent, which was natural selection. And so natural selection is what he proposed, and it refers to a process whereby animals or organisms who successfully adapt to their environment will live to pass on their genes. And those genes that get passed on include the traits that made the parent survive in the environment. And so the organisms that survive to pass on their genes are the ones who most dominantly impact the gene pool. And a good example of this is the peacock. So it is widely believed that all male peacocks have the bright, colorful tail feathers we usually associate them with. But that's actually not the case. Evidently, the female peacocks are attracted to males with colorful feathers. And so when mating season arrives, the males with the most colorful feathers are the ones who will reproduce. And this process repeats over and over again. And so the male peacocks who don't have the colorful feathers will not reproduce, and those with colorful feathers do. And so eventually, what you end up with are huge populations of male peacocks with colorful tail feathers, to the extent that it is more common now to find males with colorful feathers than it is to find them without them. And so that's natural selection. That's these things that Darwin observed in nature, and he said, hey, this works. We can connect this, and then he started theorizing that this is the mechanism for all change between species. And so organisms change based on the information present in the gene pool. So now we're kind of bringing this full circle, but while others before Darwin did propose the what of evolution, which is that organisms all descend from single ancestry, Darwin now proposed the how of evolution, which is how that descent occurred. And this proposal became widely popular and almost universally accepted among scientists almost immediately, since this mechanism of evolution could now answer pretty much everything. And it made everything evolution needed in order to be a fully fledged functioning theory, and created building blocks upon which his successors would construct numerous other theories. The catch, of course, was that for all this change to occur, massive amounts of time are needed, which he did actually defer to. He did actually admit that. So obviously an ape does not change into a human overnight. Apparently this is something that takes thousands, if not millions of years. And so therefore an old Earth view is mandatory in order for evolution to work. Additionally, where the original life forms came from, or where the first piece of material in the universe came from, interestingly enough, Darwin really didn't take that on full scale. He didn't have a lot of public discussion or debate on it, so sometimes it's hard to see where he landed. But he actually didn't have a line drawn in the sand of where he believed creation originated. However, Lamarck did. He believed it was spontaneous generation. Darwin actually, I couldn't find anything to prove this. This is really just from secondhand accounts. But apparently Darwin said he didn't believe that right now science had the answer to explain it. And so he just kind of backed away from talking about that or drawing that line in the sand. But the general theory of evolution, as it is known today, is laid out before us as early as 1860. With Darwin's work complete on the origin of species and with the scientific community now agreeing with it, you have pretty much evolution now as early as 1860. And as you would imagine, the church was pretty divided on this issue, with some theologians and pastors affirming that these views could be reconciled to the scriptures, and some others stating that they could not. The two main areas where the church really kind of backed away from evolution, or the main points that they disagreed, number one was the amounts of time required for this to work, because obviously the scriptures were very clear that the world was created in 7 days. And you also have the historicity of Adam to worry about. But the second reason was, and this is kind of the main reason, the second reason is because of the impact it had to anthropology. Because if man is no longer quote-unquote special, if man is not unique and man is just an animal, and there's no difference between him and the rest of the animals, then that's a pretty big problem as well. And that creates an ethical quandary and moral quandary, and we'll talk about that in a couple minutes from now. But those were really the two reasons the church disagreed, and they kind of backed away from it. You did have many people who did affirm it in the church. You did have many pastors and theologians who did, of course, but for the ones who didn't, those are really the two sparring grounds that where they disagreed. But regardless, society at large, around 1860 and onward, they seemed to love the idea. And even though Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, was published in 1859, his theories were widely believed as early as 1860, so less than a year. So society craved for something that diminished the cognitive dissonance they felt when ridding themselves of their belief in God. The unregenerate man hates God, and so he quickly latches on to any theory that allows him to be rid of God. And with Darwin's contribution to evolution, this is now what society has. They have a fully functioning theory that is systematic and comprehensive, something that is just logical enough to allow the unregenerate man to not feel foolish for rejecting the notion of God's existence, but to actually allow them to puff themselves up about it and to make themselves feel intelligent for rejecting the notion of God's existence. And of course, for the last bit of our time together, we'll discuss evolution's incorporation into education and then society at large. A big way that you impact society and culture is through education, because everyone is educated. And so a big way to get your foot in the door, to get an idea in the door, is through the education process. And we see that over and over again in sociology. But since evolutionary theories became more widely accepted, they eventually became standardized scientific principles. And for practical purposes, they were considered facts. They were consequently incorporated into scientific education and curricula. This did not happen overnight, of course, but was a gradual occurrence. And one kind of thing that led to this is the federal government getting involved in the education process. But in the late 1800s, state governments still had primary control over what was taught in schools. And so some states went so far as to ban the teaching of evolution, while some mandated it. Many educators attempted to fight against both laws, those mandating the teaching of creationism and those mandating the teaching of evolution. One of the most famous examples, I'm sure this is familiar to most of you, but one of the most famous examples of an educator fighting the mandate to teach creationism was John Scopes, a biology teacher in Tennessee. The state of Tennessee in 1925 had made it illegal to teach something that contradicts biblical creationism. And John Scopes disobeyed this law, and he was convicted in court in a trial that would later be known as the Scopes trial, which is often considered a landmark case in the history of evolution in public schools. And while he was found guilty of breaking the law, this started a ripple effect, and many educators started to get involved in campaigning for the teaching of evolution. And then they were backed by the full weight of the American Civil Liberties Union. What kind of helped break this dam down and let the floodwaters unleash is that then in 1968, the Supreme Court overturned state laws that banned the teaching of evolution, which of course then largely opened the doors for all schools to largely teach whatever they wanted. And then progressively, the publication of textbooks that taught evolution became much more voluminous than those that taught creationism, and public schools began to gravitate towards those ad nauseum. And so here we are, and this leads us here to 2022. And then anyone who is born into this culture and raised in this culture is going to encounter evolution in some shape or form. But that's it. So there you have it. The basics of macroevolution and its history. And so to end, I want to talk just for a minute a little bit about the effects that this has had on anthropology. As you can imagine, the effects were detrimental. The church caught wind of this. The church can kind of see where this was going. You even had philosophers, secular philosophers, mind you, who saw where this was going as well. Nietzsche is probably the most significant. But as you can imagine, it was pretty detrimental. In the evolutionary system, man was nothing more than an animal. And he was not separate from animals as the Bible teaches, but instead he is an animal. And as a matter of fact, there's nothing particularly special about man in the evolutionary model. I mean, he's a highly advanced species, sure, but eventually he will die out. And there will come another species, another life form, another organism, what have you, that will be superior to man and will have adapted to the world's environment even better. And then that species will be dominant, apparently. And because man is not significant, and this is where it really gets, where the rub is, I guess, but because man is not significant, the killing of man is not significant, be it inside or outside the womb. When man is not objectively valued, the killing or mistreatment of man cannot be objectively or at least rationally hated. And then the door to a plethora of horrific scenarios is opened. And this is, of course, why the 1900s was one of the bloodiest centuries in human history. Evolution was a basis used for many atrocities that were committed in this time period, and the world finds itself in a moral and ethical crisis due to the lack of an objective value of humans. It is an anthropological crisis. Moreover, since there's no objective basis for valuing humans, there's no objective basis for valuing human relationships. And so homosexuality, incest, rape, polygamy, and all sorts of sexual atrocities are not only allowed, but could logically be encouraged and advocated for within an evolutionary framework. And further, since human life is undervalued, abortion is also something that, again, not only is allowed, but actually makes sense and can be advocated for within an evolutionary framework. And then since evolution's mechanism is natural selection, if you want to advance the human race or species, or want to advance human civilization and speed up the evolution's mechanism here in the evolutionary process, then mass killings and suicide and active euthanasia can become justifiable on evolutionary grounds. And so again, the gates are opened in this model to a flood of horrific atrocities. And this is because the further the world gets from God, the more it descends into madness and into absolute chaos. And so may we take the history of evolutionary theory as a reminder to us to not make the Bible conform to what we observe or what we think, but rather to take what we observe and think and conform it to the Scriptures. Because the Scriptures is our foundation, and when you get out of the Scriptures, when it is no longer your anchor, when you dislodge it, when it is no longer your objective truth, you are now on waters and not on the rock. you have no objective basis, you have no objective values, and there is no rationale, and so anything goes, and the world then becomes this gigantic wasteland and free-for-all where you are indeed in an ethical and moral crisis. And so may the Bible be our anchor, and that is the kind of the dark history of evolution. While the invention or the conceptualization and the thinking and the processing of evolution, while that itself may not have been dark in terms of, while it may not have involved in wars and all these ethical crises, the effects of it certainly did. The effects of it certainly did. And so I'll end on this quote with Spurgeon on speaking of the importance of the Bible being our anchor here. But the word of God is the anvil upon which the opinions of men are smashed. And I'll close this in prayer. Father, we thank you for the truth in your word, and we thank you for the objective values and morality that you teach us through your word. Father, we read and all this history of evolution and the development, and we look at all these scientists and philosophers and all of these people, and I think sometimes we can be intimidated by the intellect of these men and by the mental fortitude that these men have and all their intellectual grandeur. And so sometimes we can forget and we can get sidetracked. And Father, sometimes I think we get in this habit of thinking that this debate between evolution and the world or creationism is that this debate is an intellectual debate when in reality it's a spiritual one. And so may we be reminded of the truth, and may we continue to put your scriptures at the forefront of our thoughts and the forefront of our knowledge, and to remember that we are Christians going into an unregenerate world. And that while some of these might look intellectually appeasing, we know that the effects of the beliefs are ultimately damning. And we know as well that the truth of your scriptures tell us that these things are wrong. And so, Father, may our allegiance to you be the first and foremost thing in our mind, and may that be our top priority, and may allegiance, therefore, to your word as well be our primary authority and be our primary goal. So teach us to love the truth of your word, teach us to follow the truth of your word, teach us to abide by the truth of your word, and teach us to know the truth of your word. Instill within us the habit of consulting it and conforming to it, and may we all be like the Bereans, who not only takes what we see in theology and conforms it to the scriptures, but also to what we see in science, to what we see in politics, to what we see in everything. May we remember that your word, while it is theological, it doesn't only impact theological areas, or rather all areas are theological. So even if we see things in the scientific community, if we see them in politics, if we see them in education, if we see them anywhere, may our first instinct be to go back to the truth of your word and to conform what we see to it. And Father, we ask for the rest of our time together that you bless the preaching of your word. We ask that you bless our pastor and the preaching and teaching of it. We ask that you bless us as the hearers, and may we focus and may we be attentive. And may our worship of you be pleasing, and may it be done in obedience to the scriptures and to what you have commanded of us. And we ask these things in the name of your Son. Amen.